Flight attendant slaps a 5-year-old girl without knowing who her mother is. Helen sat with her young daughter, Sophia, dressed in an exceedingly modest manner. Neither of them resembled the usual passengers in the VIP cabin, a detail that did not escape Mariah, a young flight attendant with a sharp gaze. "They're probably just lucky winners of some promotional free ticket giveaway," Mariah whispered to her colleague, Charles, as they passed Helen's seat. Charles frowned in disapproval but said nothing. The flight began smoothly, but the atmosphere in the VIP cabin quickly shifted when Sophia accidentally spilled her juice onto the tray table. Mariah approached, her expression openly irritated. "This is unbelievable. Please control your child," Mariah said, her tone biting. Helen quickly apologized, trying to wipe the table with napkins. "I'm so sorry. She didn't mean to." But Mariah didn't stop. She crossed her arms, glaring at Sophia. "You should teach your daughter how to behave. This is the VIP cabin, not a playground." A few passengers around them began to turn their heads, their annoyance spreading through the air. Sophia hung her head, her cheeks flushing red as she muttered, "I'm sorry." Sensing the whispers and glances from those around them, Helen remained composed. "I'll be more careful." "Thank you," she said calmly. "Let's hope so," Mariah replied curtly before turning on her heel and walking away, not without casting one last disdainful look over her shoulder. The tension began to dissipate but only temporarily. A little while later, Sophia tugged softly at Mariah's sleeve as she passed by. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry," the little girl said timidly. Mariah turned back, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Don't touch me," she snapped, but Sophia still looked at her with innocent eyes, her small hand lightly clutching Mariah's sleeve. Suddenly, Mariah lost control. Smack! The sharp sound of a slap shattered the silence of the first-class cabin. Sophia stumbled back towards Helen, clutching her cheek, tears streaming down her face. Helen immediately embraced her daughter, her eyes filled with fury, though she restrained herself and said nothing. The cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers were stunned, and some began whispering their reactions. "What just happened? Did she really hit that child?" a nearby woman exclaimed. Charles, standing at a distance, hurried over. "Mariah! What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice steady but clearly tinged with shock. Mariah, realizing she had crossed a line, refused to apologize. Instead, she tilted her chin up, feigning composure. "I was simply teaching her a lesson. That child has no manners, and her mother doesn't teach her anything." "A lesson?" An elderly man, Mr. Lewis, stood up from a row ahead. "What gives you the right to slap a child? That is utterly unacceptable." Other passengers began voicing their agreement, creating a wave of discontent in the cabin. "She should be disciplined," one woman said loudly. Mariah turned to Mr. Lewis, her voice laced with defiance. "You don't know the full story, so don't judge. And you're not my boss." Mr. Lewis refused to back down. "Do you realize where you are? This is an airline, not your private home. If you can't behave appropriately, you shouldn't be in this position." Charles gently tugged at Mariah's arm, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Mariah, that's enough. Let me handle this." But Mariah jerked her arm free, continuing to defend herself. "They don't belong here. I'm sure their tickets are just some lucky giveaway or a handout." Helen remained silent, her eyes steady as they locked on Mariah with quiet determination. Suddenly, another flight attendant, Isabella, approached Helen gently. "I'm so sorry about this," Isabella said softly, her eyes filled with concern. "It's okay," Helen replied quietly, stroking Sophia's hair as the little girl sobbed in her arms. "My daughter will be fine." Mariah glared at Isabella, her face filled with indignation. "Why are you apologizing to them? This wasn't my fault." Charles sighed and pulled Mariah further away. "Mariah, if you keep this up, we'll have to report this to management. Mariah stormed off, but the disapproving gazes of the passengers followed her. A flicker of unease began to creep into her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. Relying on her connections with senior management, she felt confident she could escape any consequences. Meanwhile, Helen focused on calming Sophia. "You're okay, sweetheart," she whispered. But her eyes swept across the cabin, quietly taking in every detail. No one in the VIP cabin could have guessed that this was only the beginning. Mariah briskly walked to the back of the cabin, keenly aware of the disapproving stares following her. Part of her understood she had crossed a line, but her pride and temper prevented her from admitting any wrongdoing. Tossing her hair back, she tried to appear composed, though her palms were sweating. "Mariah, what were you thinking?" Charles appeared beside her, his voice low but laced with reproach. "I don't need a lecture, Charles," Mariah snapped, her eyes flicking toward the row where Helen and Sophia were seated. "That child and her mother don't deserve to be here. They're ruining the atmosphere for people who truly belong." Charles sighed, shaking his head. "They're passengers, Mariah. And more importantly, you have no right to slap a child. Do you realize what you've done? Do you think I'm afraid?" Mariah sneered, though her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "I know Director Raoul. I have connections. A few complaints won't matter. They can't touch me." Charles stared at her for a long moment, saying nothing. He knew his colleague well, arrogant, entitled, and always relying on personal connections to evade accountability. But this time, he sensed the simmering tension in the VIP cabin. These passengers weren't the type to let this go easily. Meanwhile, Helen sat quietly, holding Sophia close. The little girl clung to her mother, her cheek still red from Mariah's hand. Helen gently stroked her daughter's hair, her voice soothing. "You're okay, Sophia. I'm here with you. Everything will be fine." A woman seated across from them, Mrs. Teresa, could no longer stay silent. She leaned toward Helen, her eyes full of sympathy. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for what happened. That flight attendant had no right to act that way." Teresa shook her head, her voice trembling with anger. "I've never seen such behavior." Helen turned to her, offering a faint but polite smile. "Thank you. I just hope my daughter isn't too affected." From the row ahead, Mr. Lewis, who had spoken up earlier, turned back to face her. "Do you plan to file a complaint?" he asked, his voice firm. "What happened cannot go unaddressed. No child deserves to be treated that way, especially not on a first-class flight." Helen nodded slowly. "I'll handle it. But not right now. My priority is ensuring my daughter is okay." Lewis smiled approvingly. "That's right. But know that I, and many other passengers here, are ready to back you up. You're not alone." At the back of the cabin, Mariah was still arguing with Charles, but her eyes kept darting toward the front, where Helen and Sophia were seated. Anxiety grew within her as she noticed more passengers whispering and exchanging disapproving looks. "Look, Mariah," Charles lowered his voice, trying to reason with her. "Those passengers are unhappy, and they have the right to file a complaint. They could take this up with management, and if they do, no one will be able to protect you." "Let them try," Mariah replied, attempting to mask her unease with a defiant tone. "I don't believe Helen or anyone else in this cabin has the power to do anything to me." Charles was about to respond when Isabella, the other flight attendant, approached. "Charles, I need to speak with you," Isabella said, casting a quick glance at Mariah before pulling Charles aside. "Do you see what's happening?" Isabella said quietly, her voice filled with concern. "The atmosphere in the cabin is terrible. We need to do something before this spirals out of control." Charles nodded. "I know, but Mariah won't listen. She can't keep behaving like this," Isabella insisted. "If we don't act, things will get much worse." Meanwhile, Mariah tried to maintain an air of confidence, but her growing discomfort was evident. The passengers' stares felt like daggers, piercing through her pride. She began recalling past incidents where she had been criticized, times when she only escaped trouble thanks to personal connections. From her seat, Helen looked up at Mariah, her gaze steady and resolute. Mariah suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. Helen was unlike any passenger Mariah had dismissed before. The woman's calm demeanor belied something sharp and strong, and this realization unsettled Mariah more than she cared to admit. Yet, she tried to push the feeling aside. Nearby, Isabella returned to Helen's seat. She bowed her head slightly and spoke in a low voice. "I sincerely apologize for my colleague's actions. I don't know how to make amends." "It's all right," Helen interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "I'll handle this in my own way." Isabella nodded slightly. Helen's response only heightened the tension. A storm was brewing, and everyone on this flight could feel it. Mariah turned and walked back toward the service station, trying to steady herself. But inside, her unease continued to grow. Unlike before, this time, it felt like things had spiraled beyond her control. She tried to ignore the passengers' eyes, but they seemed to follow her like shadows. "Who does she think she is?" Teresa whispered to Mr. Lewis. "This is disgraceful." "Don't worry," Lewis replied. "We'll make sure this is addressed. She won't get away with it." Helen gently patted Sophia on the shoulder, her eyes glinting with an unreadable expression. The cabin remained heavy with tension, yet it felt like something was on the verge of erupting. In the VIP cabin, the atmosphere remained tense following Mariah's slap. The passengers, though not vocal, exchanged looks filled with indignation. Helen stayed quiet, patiently comforting Sophia as if giving her daughter the space to process the shock. However, her silence was not an act of surrender but of preparation. A few passengers gathered near Helen's seat, visibly showing their support. At the service station, Mariah kept glancing at her watch, wishing time would move faster. She told herself that once the flight ended, everything would blow over. But deep down, Mariah sensed the looming danger, one that stemmed not from anyone else but from herself. Charles and Isabella stood talking in a corner. Charles spoke in a low tone, "We can't let this continue. If we do nothing, the airline will face serious trouble." "Exactly," Isabella agreed. "But Mariah is so stubborn. I doubt she'll admit she was wrong." "We don't have a choice," Charles said, looking toward the back of the cabin where Mariah was standing. "We need to talk to her now." Near the middle of the cabin, Lewis approached Helen. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I hope you don't feel alone in this. Many of us witnessed what happened, and we're ready to stand by you if you need us." Helen looked up and offered a faint smile. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." Lewis nodded, his gaze resting on Sophia. "She's very brave. What happened should never have occurred. I'm deeply sorry for what you and your daughter have had to endure." Sophia looked up, her eyes still red. She murmured, "I didn't mean to make her mad." "My love, this isn't your fault," Helen quickly reassured her, her voice gentle but firm. "You did nothing wrong. No one has the right to treat you that way. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded, her fear slowly fading. Lewis placed a comforting hand on Helen's shoulder, his voice empathetic, "I trust you'll handle this. But if you need help, we're here." At the back of the cabin, Charles and Isabella approached Mariah. Both looked at her with stern expressions. "Mariah, we need to talk," Charles began. "What happened earlier crossed the line. You need to reflect on what you've done." Mariah spun around, her face irritated. "You again? I don't need another lecture." "Listen to me," Charles emphasized. "Your actions don't just affect you, they impact the whole team and the airline. Do you have any idea what the passengers are saying? They're going to file complaints, and this time, it won't just blow over. Let them try, Mariah replied defiantly. I don't care. Isabella interjected, her voice calm but firm. Mariah, we're not siding with the passengers, but what you did is indefensible. If you keep this up, even we won't be able to help you. Mariah stared at Isabella, her lips pressed tightly together. Isabella's words struck a nerve, but Mariah fought to maintain her composure. You're making a big deal out of nothing. This was just a minor misunderstanding. Minor? Charles almost couldn't believe his ears. You slapped a child in front of everyone, Mariah. If that's minor, I don't know what major looks like. Without waiting for Mariah's response, Isabella shook her head and walked away. She didn't want to waste more words, knowing Mariah wouldn't change easily. Charles sighed, his expression filled with disappointment. Meanwhile, Sophia had stopped crying, though her face still showed traces of fear. A young female passenger, Rosa, seated across the aisle, hesitantly approached. Excuse me, is there anything I can do to help? Rosa asked, her eyes filled with concern as she looked at Helen. There's no need, Helen replied politely. But thank you for your kindness. You're truly strong, Rosa said with a small smile. If I were in your position, I don't think I could stay as calm as you have. Helen met Rosa's gaze, her eyes expressing gratitude. Sometimes, staying calm is the only way to protect my daughter. Rosa nodded. We're all on your side. Rosa's words served as a quiet affirmation, warming the tense atmosphere for Helen. Several other passengers began to nod in agreement, showing their support through silent gestures and encouraging looks. Mariah felt the weight of pressure on her shoulders as more and more passengers voiced their support for Helen. She glanced at her watch again, silently wishing the flight would end soon. Yet, the growing unease within her refused to subside. From a distance, Helen watched Mariah, her gaze calm yet brimming with an intimidating inner strength. No one could guess what Helen was thinking, but it was clear she had no intention of letting the matter slide easily. Sophia tugged gently at her mother's sleeve and whispered, Mom, I want to go home. Helen stroked her daughter's hair and pulled her into a comforting embrace. I know, sweetheart. Just a little longer, and we'll be home. Helen's words were more than a promise to Sophia, they were a promise to herself. She had been silent for too long. But this silence was not a sign of weakness, it was the calm before a brewing storm. The atmosphere in the VIP cabin remained heavy, like a dark cloud looming over everyone. Helen sat quietly with Sophia, her hand gently stroking her daughter's soft hair to soothe her. Outwardly, she maintained her composure, but inside, a tempest was rising. Helen knew that if she didn't act, this incident would leave an indelible scar on Sophia's heart. Does it hurt, my love? Helen asked softly, her voice filled with a worry she tried to hide. Sophia shook her head faintly, but the redness in her eyes and the mark still visible on her cheek told the truth. The little girl clung tightly to her mother, seeking solace. Nearby, Mr. Lewis continued observing the situation. His face was etched with frustration. Turning to Mrs. Teresa, seated in the same row, he said quietly, We can't let this pass. It's disgraceful. Absolutely, Teresa agreed. She needs to be held accountable. This isn't just unprofessional, it's outright violent. Lewis nodded firmly. If Helen decides to file a complaint, I'll testify. Behavior like this cannot be tolerated. At the back of the cabin, Mariah was trying to appear busy. She checked the drink trays and napkins, but her movements lacked the usual confidence. Charles and Isabella had left, leaving Mariah alone to face the judgmental stares of the passengers. Mariah sighed, drumming her fingers lightly on the service counter. She felt as if everyone in the cabin was against her. It was just a slap, she muttered to herself. They're blowing this out of proportion. But even as she tried to justify her actions, she couldn't deny that the situation was slipping out of her control. Mariah knew these passengers could easily escalate the matter to higher-ups. This time, could she truly escape the consequences? Mariah. Charles's voice startled her as he appeared behind her, his expression stern. I think you should apologize to them. Mariah turned sharply, narrowing her eyes. What are you talking about? Why should I apologize? I didn't do anything wrong. Charles shook his head, his voice calm but firm. If you don't realize you've crossed the line, then I can't help you. But remember, you can't rely on your connections forever. There will come a time when everything falls apart. Don't talk to me like you're my boss, Mariah snapped, her tone cold. I know what I'm doing. Charles sighed, saying nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Mariah standing alone. Her stubbornness rendered him powerless. In the seating area, a group of passengers had gathered near Helen. Rosa, the young woman seated across from her, was the first to speak. Helen, I'm truly sorry for what happened. If there's anything I can do to help, I'm here. Helen nodded, offering a faint smile. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Louis also stepped closer, his eyes filled with determination. We saw everything. If you decide to take action, we'll stand with you. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, whispering amongst themselves, their indignation evident. Helen felt a quiet strength emanating from these strangers, giving her the confidence to face the situation. Isabella walked quickly to Charles, who was leaning against the counter. This can't go on, she said urgently. If we don't act, this will escalate. I've spoken to Mariah, but she won't listen, Charles replied, shaking his head. She's too arrogant. Then what do we do? If the airline receives a formal complaint, this will be disastrous. Charles thought for a moment before responding. We need to report this to the flight manager. This is no longer a personal matter. Isabella nodded, agreeing with Charles's suggestion. She glanced toward Mariah, who stood alone at the back of the cabin, trying to ignore everything. Isabella felt helpless but knew she couldn't do much to change Mariah's mindset. Meanwhile, Helen bent down and whispered to Sophia, Sweetheart, are you feeling better? Yes, Mom, Sophia replied, her voice still trembling. But I'm scared. Helen stroked her daughter's hair, her eyes soft but resolute. It's okay. I'll protect you. No one has the right to hurt you. Sophia clung to her mother, seeking safety in her familiar embrace. Helen kissed her daughter's hair gently, her heart aching. She knew she couldn't let this incident slide. Rosa, watching the scene from nearby, spoke softly, Helen, I think you should take action. Not just for yourself, but for your daughter. Helen met Rosa's gaze, her eyes reflecting agreement. You're right. I won't let this be forgotten. Louis nodded from the other side. We'll be here to support you. Mariah stood at the back of the cabin, trying to look busy, but her mind was in turmoil. She glanced toward the passengers and saw them gathered around Helen. Her anxiety grew, but she still refused to admit it. She kept telling herself that everything would blow over soon, but this time, things didn't seem as simple as before. Helen sat quietly, her piercing gaze fixed on Mariah. She didn't utter a word, but her eyes carried an unspoken promise that Mariah would face the consequences. The cabin fell into a tense silence, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. An invisible tension hung over the entire flight, making Mariah feel suffocated. She knew a storm was coming, yet she still tried to ignore it. Mariah attempted to maintain her composure as she walked through the rows of seats, but she could feel the cold, sharp stares of the passengers following her every move. She took a deep breath, hoping her usual arrogance would carry her through this storm. However, deep inside, her unease grew, like an uncontrollable undertow. Just focus on your job, Mariah, she told herself, trying to push away the negative thoughts. But every time her gaze landed on Helen, an uncomfortable feeling crept over her. Helen hadn't said a word, but her silent determination unnerved Mariah far more than any loud complaint ever could. At the front of the cabin, Helen sat beside Sophia, her eyes never leaving Mariah. Helen didn't need to do much, her gaze said everything. A silent yet powerful message: I will not let this go. Sophia had stopped crying, but she clung tightly to her mother, as if afraid Mariah might approach again. Helen gently stroked her daughter's hair, her voice soothing. Everything will be okay, sweetheart. You don't need to be scared. But she hates me, Sophia whispered, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. No one has the right to hate you just for being yourself, Helen replied, her voice steady with conviction. People like that are not worth your concern. In another corner, Charles and Isabella were speaking quietly, their tones tense. We have to do something, Isabella said, glancing toward Mariah. Otherwise, this will only get worse. Charles shook his head. She won't listen. I've tried talking to Mariah, but she's too stubborn. Then we need to report this to the flight manager, Isabella insisted. This situation cannot continue. If the passengers file formal complaints, we'll be implicated too. Charles was silent for a moment before nodding. All right. I'll speak to the manager. Isabella exhaled deeply, though her expression remained anxious. Let's hope this doesn't escalate further. Meanwhile, in the seating area, a group of passengers began gathering near Helen. Louis, the elderly gentleman, stood up, looking around before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. What happened was unacceptable. I think we all agree that the flight attendant needs to be held accountable. Exactly, Rosa, the young woman, chimed in. Helen and her daughter didn't deserve to be treated like that. This is the VIP cabin, and we expect professionalism, not behavior like this. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Teresa, an older woman sitting nearby, added, I completely agree. If necessary, we should submit a collective complaint. Helen glanced around, her expression filled with gratitude. Thank you, everyone. I truly appreciate your support. Louis placed a reassuring hand on Helen's shoulder, his voice firm yet calm. We're not just standing with you, we're standing for what's right. Behavior like that needs to be addressed. At the back of the cabin, Mariah was starting to feel the passengers' growing dissatisfaction. She tried to act indifferent, but she couldn't ignore the murmurs and disapproving glances directed at her. Mariah's pride was wounded, but her arrogance wouldn't allow her to admit fault. Who do they think they are? Mariah muttered under her breath, clenching her fists. I don't need them telling me what to do. But deep down, Mariah knew that this time, things weren't as simple as before. Her connections might have protected her in the past, but could they shield her forever? Helen sat quietly, her gaze fixed on Mariah as though she was contemplating something important. No one knew what Helen was planning, but her silence carried an invisible weight that only added to Mariah's unease. Sophia tugged gently on her mother's sleeve, her small voice barely audible, Mom, I want to go home. Helen bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead. I know, sweetheart. We'll be home soon. Nearby, Rosa observed the scene and quietly commented to Teresa, she's so strong. I don't think I could stay this calm if I were in her place. You're right, Teresa replied. But it's that calmness that's most frightening. That flight attendant should be worried. Mariah walked briskly toward the service station, trying to avoid the passengers' stares. But the more she tried to ignore them, the more suffocated she felt. Every whisper, every glance felt like a needle pricking at her confidence. Charles returned, looking at Mariah with a stern expression. Mariah, I've reported the situation to the flight manager. They'll handle this. Mariah jolted and turned sharply. You did what? I had no choice, Charles replied, his tone cold. If you refuse to apologize, I had to take action. Isabella stepped forward, adding, This isn't personal, Mariah. This is about our responsibility to the passengers. Mariah pressed her lips together, her eyes flashing with anger. But this time, she said nothing. It felt as though the ground beneath her was beginning to crumble. From her seat, Helen watched Mariah from afar, her gaze calm yet full of unspoken resolve. Sophia had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, but Helen showed no signs of fatigue. Instead, her eyes gleamed with determination, as if she had made an important decision. In the VIP cabin, the silence was heavy, but it was not peaceful. It was the silence before a storm. Everyone could feel it, and Mariah knew this time, there was no escape. The tension in the VIP cabin remained palpable, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. The murmurs had quieted, but the passengers' gazes remained fixed on Mariah, who stood at the back of the cabin with a strained expression. Isabella and Charles, though silent, kept a watchful eye on their colleague. Helen, sitting beside her sleeping daughter, maintained her composure. While Sophia rested on her shoulder, Helen stayed vigilant. She could feel the silent support from the passengers around her, which gave her the strength to act. At the back of the cabin, Mariah bent down to check the service tray, but her hands trembled slightly. The unease in her heart grew stronger. The passengers' piercing gazes felt like flames burning away her usual confidence. Mariah knew they were all waiting for her to apologize, but her pride refused to let her do so. Charles approached Mariah and spoke quietly, "They're waiting, Mariah. Just apologize and end this." "I didn't do anything wrong," Mariah replied, her voice low but defiant. "I have nothing to apologize for." Charles sighed, shaking his head. "You can't keep relying on your connections to get by. Eventually, this will catch up to you." Mariah didn't respond, but the fear within her grew. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff, one push away from falling. Louis, the elderly gentleman near Helen, stood up and directed his gaze toward Charles and Isabella. His patience had run out. "We need answers," Louis said loudly, his voice carrying through the cabin. "The behavior of that flight attendant cannot be condoned. Helen and her daughter deserve an apology." Other passengers began voicing their agreement. Rosa added, "We paid for premium service, and we expect respect from the crew." Teresa nodded in agreement. "If we don't get a satisfactory explanation, we'll file a collective complaint." The passengers' words crashed over Mariah like a tidal wave. She felt her throat go dry, and her limbs grew weak. Though she tried to appear composed, her panicked eyes betrayed her. Helen sat silently, but her silence was the greatest pressure on Mariah. A storm was brewing, and Mariah could feel it looming. She tried to avoid Helen's gaze, but it felt as though those piercing eyes followed her relentlessly, offering no escape. Isabella approached Mariah, her tone firmer this time. "Mariah, if you don't take responsibility, I'm afraid this situation will spiral out of control. You need to act now." "I don't need anyone teaching me how to do my job," Mariah retorted, though her voice lacked its usual strength. "This is just a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Isabella raised an eyebrow, unable to hide her frustration. "Do you really think slapping a child is just a misunderstanding?" Isabella's words rang loud and clear, catching the attention of a few nearby passengers who turned to look. Mariah felt as though she had been exposed in front of everyone. She clenched her fists, trying to maintain composure, but deep down, she was at a loss for what to do. Meanwhile, Helen gently stroked Sophia's hair, her eyes staring straight ahead as though she were deep in thought. Rosa, sitting nearby, spoke softly, "You don't have to endure this alone, Helen. We're all on your side." "Thank you," Helen replied, her voice calm and steady. "I know what I need to do." Louis, standing nearby, smiled at Helen. "You're incredibly strong. If you need any support, let us know." Helen didn't respond, but her determined gaze said it all. She didn't need to speak much, everyone around her could feel that she was ready to act. Mariah felt the weight of the growing tension pressing down on her. She glanced around, seeing passengers glaring at her with reproachful eyes. Isabella and Charles stood nearby, their disappointment evident. Everything seemed to be against her. What am I supposed to do? Mariah wondered, her mind filled with conflict. She knew that apologizing could potentially save her from this situation, but her pride wouldn't allow her to bow her head. Mariah had always believed she could rely on her connections to escape any problem, but this time, was that enough? Helen stood up, gently placing Sophia back in her seat. Every eye in the cabin followed her as she walked slowly forward. The atmosphere became eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath in anticipation. Helen stopped in front of Mariah, her eyes locking onto the young flight attendant. Without needing to say much, Helen's gaze conveyed a clear message: the silence ends now. Do you have something to say? Helen asked, her voice calm but powerful. Mariah looked at Helen, feeling cornered. She pressed her lips together, trying to hold on to her remaining pride, but Helen's unwavering gaze and the watchful eyes of the passengers shattered her defenses. I, Mariah stammered, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin seemed to press down on her, leaving no escape. Helen turned and walked back to her seat without waiting for an answer. Her calmness made Mariah feel even more suffocated. In the VIP cabin, the atmosphere froze, but everyone understood that this was merely the calm before the real storm. The flight landed, and the cabin doors opened to reveal the bright lights of the airport outside. But what made Mariah freeze in her tracks was the sight waiting at the entrance. Raoul, the airline's executive director, stood at the doorway. Beside him was a group of senior staff in formal attire, their faces grim. Mariah felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. Helen and Sophia prepared to disembark and noticed Raoul's presence. Helen wasn't surprised. Her sharp gaze remained calm, her face composed. Raoul is here, Helen murmured to Sophia, as if speaking to herself. Things will be resolved. Sophia looked up, still clinging to her mother. Mom, she won't hurt me again, will she? Helen bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead. No, sweetheart. No one will ever hurt you again. Raoul stepped into the VIP cabin, his eyes sweeping across the passengers before landing on Mariah. Mariah, explain your behavior, he demanded. Mariah tried to maintain her composure, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Mr. Raoul, this was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to harm anyone. Things have been blown out of proportion. Raoul raised a hand to cut her off. Misunderstanding? I've heard enough from the witnesses and passengers. You didn't just violate service protocols, you harmed a child. This is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Louis, the elderly passenger, stepped forward, his face filled with indignation. Mr. Raoul, I was one of the passengers who witnessed the incident. What Mariah did is inexcusable. We expect the airline to take clear and decisive action. Rosa, the young woman near Helen, added, he's right. We're all willing to testify. Helen and her daughter didn't deserve this, especially not from someone claiming to be a professional flight attendant. Mariah felt as though the blood in her veins had turned to ice. She looked around but found no support. Charles and Isabella stood at a distance, their faces reflecting disappointment. No one was on her side this time. Raoul turned to Helen, his expression softening. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for what you and your daughter have endured on this flight. This behavior does not reflect our airline's values. Helen nodded slightly and replied in a calm but firm tone, thank you. But this is not just about me. I hope your airline learns from this so no other passenger has to experience the same. Raoul paused, his eyes flickering with recognition. You're Helen Morales, aren't you? The owner of the investment group affiliated with our airline? The entire VIP cabin fell silent. Raoul's words hit like a thunderclap, shocking everyone, especially Mariah. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she stammered, "She's the owner." Helen remained composed, but her sharp gaze met Raoul's directly. "Yes, but today, I'm not here in that capacity. I'm just a mother protecting her child." Louis and Rosa exchanged looks of admiration, the realization dawning on them. "I had no idea. She's someone so important," Rosa whispered. Mariah felt as though her legs could no longer support her. She realized she hadn't just lost the passengers' respect, she now faced the wrath of the airline's owner. Every door she had once relied on to escape trouble had slammed shut. Raoul turned back to Mariah, his voice icy. "Mariah, you are immediately suspended. We will launch a formal investigation and escalate this to senior management. You should prepare yourself for the consequences." Mariah couldn't muster a single word. Her once arrogant confidence had completely crumbled. She lowered her head and quietly left the cabin, leaving behind the disdainful looks of the passengers. Helen gently lifted Sophia into her arms and walked past Raoul. "Thank you for acting swiftly. I hope this serves as a reminder to the entire system," she said. Raoul bowed slightly in respect and replied, "We will ensure this never happens again, Ms. Helen." As Helen stepped off the plane, Sophia turned back, her innocent eyes meeting Raoul's as she softly said, "Thank you for helping my mom and me." Raoul allowed a rare smile to cross his face as he bent down to meet Sophia's gaze. "You're a brave little girl. Always keep that smile, all right?" All the passengers watched as Helen and Sophia walked away. Admiration and respect filled the air for the calm and strength of the woman they had just witnessed. Mariah, now left entirely alone, faced the stark reality that everything was over. She sat by herself in the staff lounge, where the dim fluorescent lights did little to ease the turmoil in her heart. The atmosphere was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the hushed whispers of colleagues in the distance. Mariah could feel every word of their gossip cutting through the facade of confidence she had once so carefully built. The door to the lounge swung open, and Isabella entered. Her face was stern, her eyes filled with unmistakable disappointment. "Mariah, Raoul wants to see you in the executive office immediately," Isabella said, her voice devoid of the sympathy it had carried earlier. Mariah tried to take a deep breath, but the numbness in her body refused to let go. Rising slowly, she nodded and walked out, her steps heavy with dread. The executive office glowed brightly, and Raoul was already seated, waiting for her. Beside him sat several senior supervisors, each holding a file in their hands. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. "Sit down, Mariah," Raoul said, his voice low but commanding. Reluctantly, Mariah sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Raoul stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Your actions didn't just harm a child, they've tarnished the reputation of our airline. And, most critically, the person you offended is none other than Helen Morales, the airline's owner. Do you grasp the seriousness of this situation?" Mariah lifted her head, her eyes glistening with tears. She struggled to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. "I didn't know. I didn't know who she was. I didn't mean to," she stammered. Raoul slammed his hand on the desk, his voice rising in anger. "You didn't know. Even if she weren't the owner, you had no right to slap a child. This is an issue of ethics, Mariah. You crossed a line, and the consequences are unavoidable." One of the supervisors beside Raoul opened a file and began listing, "Mariah, we have received over 20 formal complaints from passengers on the flight. Some are demanding refunds and a public apology from the airline. The damage is significant, and you are responsible." Mariah hung her head, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly powerless. "Please. I'll make it right. I'll do anything," Mariah pleaded. Raoul shook his head, his expression cold. You had the chance to make it right, but you chose to deny responsibility. Your actions were clear, and no one can excuse them. Our decision is final, you are permanently suspended. You no longer have a place on our team. Raoul's words struck Mariah like a hammer blow. Her mouth fell open, unable to process what she had just heard. Permanently? Mr. Raoul, I've worked here for over 10 years. Are you going to ruin my entire career over one mistake? No, Mariah, Raoul replied, his voice chilling. You ruined your own career. When Mariah left the executive office, she couldn't bring herself to lift her head. Each step felt like a burden, and the stares from her colleagues were silent reminders of her failure. At the airport exit, Charles and Isabella waited. Isabella stepped forward, her eyes a mix of pity and disappointment. Mariah, I hope you learn from this. Sometimes, admitting your mistakes isn't a sign of weakness, it's the only way to maintain respect from others. Mariah didn't respond. She lowered her head and walked away. There was nothing left to say. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Mariah's life. Without a job, she fell into financial crisis. Bills piled up, and the relationships she had once relied on for help now crumbled. No one wanted to associate with someone who had caused such a scandal. Friends distanced themselves. A former colleague named Pilar, once close to Mariah, refused to meet her when Mariah reached out for help. I'm sorry, Mariah, Pilar said over the phone. I can't get involved in this. I hope you understand. Mariah hung up quietly, the weight of isolation pressing down on her. Her arrogance and complacency, once her pride, had become her downfall, leaving her unable to find a way forward. One day, Mariah received a letter from the airline. She opened it to find an official notice of contract termination. Mariah sank to the floor, her vacant eyes staring at the wall. She thought of her glory days, confidently striding in her uniform, respected by everyone. But all of it had disappeared, undone by a single slap born of a moment's loss of control. As months passed, Mariah began to understand that she had no one to blame but herself. One afternoon, she stood before a mirror, staring at her gaunt reflection. The proud figure she once was had faded into a shadow of regret. Mustering her courage, she wrote a heartfelt apology letter to Helen, filled with remorse and a plea for forgiveness. But Mariah never received a reply. Helen had moved on, carrying her calm and strength with her, leaving no room for Mariah's redemption. Years later, Mariah worked at a small cafe near the airport. Her life now was one of mere survival, devoid of the respect and prestige she once held. Whenever customers mentioned the airline, she would lower her gaze, avoiding their eyes. One day, while cleaning a table, Mariah saw a woman walk in with a little girl. It was Helen and Sophia. They walked past Mariah without recognizing her. Mariah stood frozen, a lump rising in her throat. She realized that Helen had moved forward, while she remained trapped in the past. And that was the greatest price Mariah had to pay, losing the chance for redemption and living with an unshakable regret. Mariah's story is a poignant reminder of the consequences of arrogance and a lack of self-control. A single thoughtless action can destroy a career and reputation built over years. Respect doesn't come from authority or position but from how we treat others. Sometimes, a timely apology can save not only relationships but also ourselves. Let humility and compassion guide you in all circumstances.